water. Of all the things that can pull a person into a state of quiet, deep calm, there is something about water that does it better than almost anything else. The sound of it, the weight of it, the way it moves without hurry and without apology. And of all the types scattered across the entire Pokemon franchise, the water type has always carried that same quality. It is the most common type in the entire series, with well over 150 individual species, and it has been there since the very beginning, woven into the world of Pokemon the way oceans are woven into the real one. You cannot map the Pokemon world without finding it. You cannot play through a single mainline game without it shaping your journey in some form. The rivers, the seas, the glittering lakes you need to cross, the soft sound effects of gentle rain, the wide blue sprawl of routes that require a trusted companion to carry you through them. Water-type Pokemon were never just mechanics, they were atmosphere. And the facts, the lore, the design decisions, the cultural mythology, the quiet strangeness buried in Pokedex entries and developer notes, and anime episodes that aired only once in Japan and never anywhere else, all of it creates this enormous layered world underneath the surface of what most people already know. Tonight we are going to go deep into that world. We are going to take our time. We are going to let the information wash over you the same way a tide comes in, slowly, steadily, carrying things you have never seen before and setting them gently at your feet. So get comfortable. Settle in. Let your breathing slow down. Whatever you are carrying from the day, you can let it drift. You do not need it right now. Right now, there is only this. The soft history of the Pokemon world's most expansive type, told in the way it deserves to be told. Let's go. The water type holds a place in the franchise that no other type quite manages to replicate. It is the type with the most individual Pokemon. It has been paired with every other type at least once as of Generation 6. It is one of the original 3 elemental types alongside fire and grass that form the starter triangle at the beginning of every mainline game, which means a water starter has been offered to players in every single numbered generation of the series, from Squirtle in 1996 to Quaxley and Gekwa in the most recent entries. That is not a coincidence or a convenience. That is a design philosophy. The developers at Game Freak built their world around the idea that water was essential, not optional, and that idea has never changed. The water type is also, in competitive terms, one of the most balanced types in the game. It is strong against fire, ground, and rock. It is resisted by water, grass, and dragon. It is weak only to electric and grass, which is a fairly short list of vulnerabilities for a type this common. This balance has kept water-type Pokemon relevant in competitive play from the original games all the way through to the modern era. There have been eras dominated by rain teams, weather-based strategies built entirely around the fact that water-type moves gain a 50% power boost during rain. There have been legendary water types that defined entire metagames. And there have been simple, ordinary water types that just quietly showed up on teams for every generation because they were reliable, because they were solid, because they did what they needed to do without fuss. That is very much in the spirit of the type. There is something else worth noting about water-type Pokemon and the way they are designed. A surprising number of them draw from real-world mythology, folklore, and biological curiosity in ways that the other types do not always achieve at the same density. The sea in human culture has always been a place of mystery. Ancient civilizations built entire pantheons of gods specifically to govern it. Sailors passed down stories of creatures in the deep that defied explanation. The ocean was the original unknown, and Game Freak, perhaps consciously and perhaps simply by following the nature of what they were designing, ended up creating a water-type roster that reflects that quality. There are Pokemon based on dragons from Chinese mythology. There are Pokemon based on plesiosaurs and the Loch Ness Monster. There are Pokemon that embody the idea of a legendary guardian that only appears to those with pure hearts. There are Pokemon drawn from Japanese yokai and Celtic legend, and scientific curiosity about bioluminescence and deep-sea creatures that most people have never heard of. The water type was present in the mechanics of the original games in a way that few other types were. Surf, the HM that allowed Pokemon to carry their trainer across water, was one of the most important moves in the entire game. not because of its combat power, but because it unlocked the map. Routes inaccessible without it held gyms and rare Pokemon and story events, and the paths between regions. The act of teaching Surf to a water-type Pokemon and pressing A at the edge of a lake was a ritual that every player performed, a small ceremony of transition. You stood at the shore and pushed forward into something new, carried by a creature that knew the water the way you knew the land. HM moves like Surf, Dive, Waterfall, and Whirlpool were the vocabulary of exploration in the Pokemon world, and they all belonged to the water type. No other type held as many keys to the map. Fire could clear small trees in some games. Normal types could move boulders, but water was where the boundaries dissolved. Water was where you went when you had exhausted the land. All of that is here, and we are going to work our way through it, piece by piece, taking our time, staying easy and relaxed, letting the deep end of the Pokemon world come into focus slowly and gently as the night moves forward. Before we dive in any further, drop a comment down below. Tell me where you are and what time it is. It might be the middle of the night where you are, lights off, headphones in, trying to get your brain to finally let go of the day. It might be early morning somewhere else, someone starting their day easy. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, let me know. And if you are not already subscribed, now is a good time. It costs nothing, takes 2 seconds, and it helps more than most people realize. Hit subscribe and the bell if you want to know when the next one drops. Now, back into the water. Part 1. The Dragon That Was Never a Dragon. Magikarp, Gyarados, and the Myth of the Carp's Ascension. There is a story that has been told in East Asian cultures for well over 1,000 years. It is the story of the carp at the Dragon Gate. The legend, in its simplest form, goes like this. There is a great waterfall somewhere along the Yellow River, a point of such fierce current and height that no ordinary fish could ever leap it. But every year, countless carp attempt to make the jump anyway, throwing themselves against the water again and again. The vast majority fail. They fall back. They try again. They fail again. But there exists, according to the legend, a rare carp that persists beyond what persistence should allow. And that carp, the one that finally makes the leap and clears the falls, is transformed. It becomes a dragon. The legend is called the Koi's Ascension in many tellings, and it has served for centuries as a metaphor for perseverance, for the idea that continued effort against impossible odds produces a transformation that cannot happen any other way. It was a common theme in ancient Chinese poetry and in the art of both China and Japan. Dragons, in East Asian tradition, are not the fire-breathing villains of Western myth. They are divine, they are powerful and majestic and wise, and they are associated with water, specifically with rivers and seas and storms. A dragon ascending from the Yellow River made perfect natural sense in that cultural context. And then Game Freak looked at that legend and built 2 Pokemon out of it. Magikarp is, by design, completely ridiculous. Its base stat total is 200, which is the lowest of any evolved Pokemon in the original 151. Its moveset in the early games consisted of essentially one move, Splash, which accomplished precisely nothing in battle. Its Pokédex entries across generations have described it as feeble, pathetically weak, and barely able to swim, kept alive primarily by the fact that it needs only minimal nutrients to survive. One early Pokédex entry notes that even the most unskilled trainer could catch one. Another mentions that they were apparently stronger in ancient times, but became weaker over generations, which is a detail so specific and strange that it reads almost like a note someone buried in the data as a joke that nobody ever removed. And yet, at level 20, something happens. The game asks you to keep going, to push past the point where most people would have released this floppy, useless fish and moved on. At level 20, after what feels like far too much patience, Magikarp leaps and the transformation begins. Gyarados is everything Magikarp is not. It stands at 6.5 meters tall. Its fangs can crush boulders. Its scales are harder than steel. The Pokédex describes it as one of the most feared creatures in the natural world, known as the Atrocious Pokémon, referred to in some regions as a deity of destruction. Its rampages, according to various entries, have been known to last for an entire month. It appears in times of conflict and burns everything in its path. One ancient entry notes that in past wars, Gyarados appeared and left blazing ruins in its wake, which is a remarkable thing to say about a water-type Pokemon, let alone one that was a helpless golden carp 10 levels prior. The reason Gyarados is so violent is actually explained in its biology, and the explanation is fascinatingly specific. The process of evolution causes a structural transformation in Gyarados' brain, one that stimulates its brain cells in a way that results in nearly perpetual rage. Mega Gyarados, its evolved form introduced in Generation 6 games, takes this further. The stress of Mega Evolution on an already violently stimulated brain leaves Mega Gyarados with almost nothing except the raw, burning instinct to raze everything in sight. The Omega Ruby Pokédex entry says this directly, noting the cellular changes that occur in the brain during evolution. It is one of the more scientifically grounded explanations for a Pokemon's behavior in the entire franchise, and it gives a certain dark weight to what otherwise reads as just a cool design. There is something else about Gyarados worth sitting with. Despite its appearance, despite the way it learns Dragon Rage and Dragon Tail and Dragon Pulse, despite the fact that celebrated dragon trainers like Lance and Claire both keep Gyarados on their teams, despite the fact that it belongs to the Dragon Egg group and has whiskers like a Chinese dragon and moves through the water with the sinuous power of every sea serpent in mythology, Gyarados is not a dragon type. It is water and flying. And this has baffled players since the first games. The flying type in particular makes almost no intuitive sense for a creature that rarely uses its wings and prefers the ocean. Various explanations have been offered over the years. Some believe the dragon type was purposely withheld to prevent Gyarados from being too powerful in the original games, where dragon type had very few weaknesses, and Gyarados with a dragon typing would have been extremely difficult to deal with. Others believe it was simply a design decision made early in development that nobody felt like revisiting. In the original beta versions of the game, Gyarados was known by the name Skullkraken, and its design was significantly different, resembling a massive eyeless leech creature rather than the sea serpent we ended up with. The name Skullkraken suggests they were drawing from the Kraken of Scandinavian myth at that stage, before the design shifted toward the Chinese dragon visual. The final result was a Pokemon deeply rooted in Chinese mythology, but given a typing that, strictly speaking, does not reflect that mythology at all. Gyarados was also involved in one of the most significant moments in the history of shiny Pokemon. When Pokemon Gold and Silver introduced the shiny mechanic, the very first story-driven encounter with a shiny Pokemon was the red Gyarados at the Lake of Rage. Every player who went to that lake encountered a Gyarados with red scales instead of blue, a guaranteed shiny in a game where shinies were otherwise extraordinarily rare. This was not an accident of design. It was intentional, a way to show players that color variants existed, to make the mechanic feel meaningful rather than just a statistical oddity discovered by obsessives. The red Gyarados became one of the most iconic moments in Pokemon Gold and Silver's story, and it was the only time in the franchise up to that point where a shiny Pokemon was written directly into the narrative. The reason for the Lake of Rage's shiny Gyarados was also tied to the plot of the games in a specific way. Team Rocket, operating from the radio tower in Goldenrod City, was broadcasting a signal on radio frequencies that was forcibly evolving Magikarp in the Lake of Rage area. The forced evolution was destabilizing the area, and the unusual frequency of the signal was causing the Gyarados who emerged from those forced evolutions to develop abnormal coloration. It was not just a shiny encounter for its own sake. It was a shiny encounter with an in-universe explanation, a consequence of Team Rocket's specific evil plan, which made it feel integrated into the world in a way that random shinies never quite achieved. It is worth pausing on the shiny Gyarados for a moment longer, because the choice to make the shiny form red rather than some other color is specific and deliberate in a way that players might not immediately notice. The Gyarados we know is blue. Its pre-evolution Magikarp is red. The shiny Gyarados is red. The color that the fully evolved, powerful, terrifying Gyarados wears in its shiny form is the color of the pathetic fish it came from. There is something almost poetic about that. The transformation is complete, the power is real, and yet the color persists. A trace of the carp at the bottom of the Dragon Gate visible in the scales of the dragon that cleared it. The counterpart to Gyarados, built into the design of Generation 3 and carrying the same thematic DNA as Milotic. But we will get to Milotic later. For now, just hold the image of the red Gyarados in your mind for a moment. The way it would have looked on a tiny Game Boy Color screen, those unmistakable crimson scales in a game that had been mostly green and brown, rising out of the lake like something that should not exist. It was the franchise showing off, quietly, what it could do when it had a good idea and the patience to execute it well. That patience, that willingness to let something useless become something extraordinary, is Magikarp and Gyarados' real legacy. Not just the mythology, not just the design, but the feeling that if you keep going, something will happen. Something will change. The leap will eventually clear the falls. Part 2. The Pokemon that melts into the water. Vaporeon and the Eevee question. There is a question that every player who started Pokemon with the Generation 1 games had to answer at some point. And it did not come with a right or wrong answer, only preference and personality, and the kind of internal logic you had built for yourself by that point in the game. You are standing in Celadon City. You have been given a gift, a single Eevee obtained from the residential building north of the main street. You have 3 stones available, a Water Stone, a Thunder Stone, and a Fire Stone, all of them sitting on the shelves of the Celadon department store. And the Eevee you are holding is unusual in a way that no other Pokemon in the game is unusual. It can become 3 entirely different things, each of them powerful and distinct, each representing a fundamental element of the world. The question is not which one is strongest. The question is which one is you. Players who chose the Water Stone got Vaporeon. Vaporeon is officially known as the Bubble Jet Pokemon, but that name has always felt slightly too simple for what Vaporeon actually is. Its molecular structure, according to the Pokédex, is similar to water molecules. Its body glitters when sunlight hits it at certain angles because of this similarity, light passing through it the way it passes through shallow water. It can melt into water and become completely invisible, using this ability to stalk and ambush prey from concealment. Some Pokédex entries specifically note that its tail fin has been mistaken for a mermaid's, which is a detail so elegantly placed that it elevates the entire design. You encounter this creature near a lake, and for a moment you think you see something in the water. Something with a divided tail and a long spine and a ridge of fins running from the back of its head. And then it is simply gone, absorbed into the reflection. Vaporeon is also, statistically speaking, the bulkiest of the original 3 evolutions by a significant margin. It has the highest base HP of any Pokemon in the Eevee family, sitting at 130, which remains true even when you include all 8 evolutions that were eventually added across multiple generations. Alongside that enormous health pool comes a strong, special attack and a respectable special defense, giving it the profile of a special tank, a Pokemon that can absorb damage and hit back hard with water. It was one of the strongest water types available in the original games, and it held that competitive relevance for years. In Pokemon Go, Vaporeon was for a period the strongest gym defender in the entire game, with a CP ceiling that outpaced most legendaries available at launch. What is fascinating about Vaporeon from a design perspective is the way it bridges the gap between land and water without fully committing to either. It has 4 legs and a body that reads as mammalian, clearly descended from Eevee's fox-like appearance. But those legs end in webbed feet. The fin encircling its neck is white and elegant, like a ruff, but it functions as a gill structure. The fins on either side of its head replace the ears that Eevee had. There is a blue ridge of spines running down its back that is distinctly aquatic, like the dorsal structure of a deep sea fish. It is an Eevee that decided the water was home and began to change itself accordingly. The Water Stone did not force it. It unlocked something that was already there, waiting. There is a thread in the wider Pokemon lore that connects Vaporeon to Suicune, the legendary water type from the Johto region, and we will explore that connection in full when we get to Suicune. But for now, consider the parallel. Vaporeon's primary ability is Water Absorb, which means it restores health instead of taking damage when it is hit by a water-type attack. Suicune's hidden ability, introduced in Generation 5, is also Water Absorb. Vaporeon is blue and associated with water and serenity and purity. Suicune is blue and associated with water and serenity and purity. Both belong to evolutionary lines or legendary trios that include a red fire type, a yellow electric type, and a blue water type with those same matching hidden abilities. The theory that the legendary beasts were once ordinary Pokemon, possibly even evolutions, who died in the fire of the burned tower and were resurrected by Ho-Oh, is one of the oldest and most persistent fan theories in the franchise, and the symmetry of Vaporeon and Suicune is one of the main reasons it has never fully gone away. Nobody at Game Freak has confirmed it. Nobody has denied it in terms that feel conclusive. The similarities are either deliberate design choices meant to hint at the connection, or an extraordinary coincidence spanning multiple generations of development. Either interpretation creates something interesting. Either the legendary beasts of Johto carry traces of the ordinary Pokemon they once were, or the designers like to type symmetry enough to echo it across two separate trios, and let the fans draw their own conclusions. The Eevee evolution line as a whole represents one of Game Freak's most thoughtful long-term design decisions. Eevee began with 3 evolutions and has grown to 8, with each new generation adding 1 or 2 more, expanding the family in ways that feel organic rather than forced. Game Freak themselves have acknowledged that fan art of potential new evolutions has made it increasingly difficult to introduce new ones without being too similar to something already imagined and circulated in the community. This is an unusual situation for a design team to be in, where fan creativity has become dense enough that it constrains official development. The flying type. Eeveelution that was reportedly prototyped during the development of Sun and Moon never made it into the games, for exactly this reason. It is out there somewhere in the concept stages of a game that came out years ago, an evolution that was designed and scrapped and never seen. Vaporeon, as the original water evolution, carries all of this history on its fins. It is the one that started the idea that Eevee could become anything, that the same ordinary, adaptable normal type could be fundamentally reshaped by the right conditions into something entirely new. Every evolution that has come since has been building on the promise that Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon made in 1996. The promise that form is not fixed, that what you are is not what you have to stay. There is a gentleness to that idea that suits a water type perfectly. Part 3. The Loch Ness Pokemon. Lapras and the History of a Gentle Giant. Almost Lost. It is a quiet evening on Route 12 in the Kanto region. The water stretches out ahead of you and there is no way across without help. A scientist in a building near the shore, grateful and worn down from an encounter with Team Rocket, offers you a Pokemon he has been looking after. It is large and blue, with a gray shell on its back covered in rounded knobs, a long neck, a small spiraling horn on its forehead, and 4 broad flippers. Its eyes are warm and brown. It makes a soft sound, something between a hum and a note, and you get on its back, and it carries you across the water. That is your first Lapras. And for most players, it became something far more than a means of transportation. Lapras is a water and ice type, and its design is directly inspired by the Plesiosaur, the prehistoric marine reptile whose body shape became the central visual reference for the Loch Ness Monster in popular culture. The connection is explicit enough that Lapras's original Japanese beta name was actually Ness, a direct reference to Nessie, the affectionate nickname for whatever it is that may or may not live in the Scottish Highlands. The name was changed before the final release, presumably because it was too on the nose, but the design intention was never hidden. Lapras is a living Loch Ness monster, made gentle and given a soul. The Pokédex entries for Lapras across multiple generations build a portrait of this creature that is genuinely affecting in its detail. Lapras is described as an intelligent Pokémon that can understand human speech. It travels in pods across the seas, spanning both polar and tropical waters, communicating with others of its kind through enchanting melodies that carry across enormous distances. It sings when it is happy. The songs have a soothing quality, and at least one episode of the anime demonstrated that Lapras can, under certain circumstances, use a form of telepathy to communicate directly with people. But the most striking part of Lapras's Pokédex history is what happened to its species. Because Lapras is gentle and docile, and because it willingly allows people to ride on its back, And because it understands human speech and trusts rather than flees, it was nearly driven to extinction by hunting. Its gentleness made it an easy target. The Pokédex entries in the original games note this directly, describing Lapras as a Pokémon that had been so overhunted that it was extremely rare in the wild. Later entries note that recent protection efforts reverse this decline so dramatically that Lapras populations in some areas have become overabundant, affecting the numbers of fish Pokémon in those regions. This is a remarkably grounded piece of ecological storytelling for a children's game. The rise and fall and rise of a Pokémon population, shaped entirely by human behavior, told in 2 sentences of Pokédex text across different game generations. Children who read those entries in sequence would absorb, without realizing it, a basic lesson about conservation, about how quickly a gentle, trusting species can be reduced when humans decide to take advantage of that gentleness, and about how careful stewardship can bring something back from the edge. In the anime, Ash's relationship with Lapras during the Orange Island saga gave the species even more emotional dimension. The Lapras Ash eventually befriended was young, separated from its pod, and initially fearful of humans due to having been mistreated. It took time and patience before it would accept Ash's presence. But once it did, it carried him faithfully across the islands, and by the end of the arc, Ash found the pod the Lapras had been separated from and returned it to its family. The goodbye was quiet and undramatic by anime standards, which somehow made it more moving. There was no dramatic farewell battle, no speech, just a young Pokémon returning to the ocean it belonged in, and a trainer letting it go because that was the right thing to do. Lapras's design also holds an interesting structural detail when you examine it against what we know about Game Freak's early design process. In the original Pokémon games, only 2 items were available to teach Lapras via TM, and Lapras's natural move pool included not just water and ice attacks, but also Psychic, Body Slam, and eventually, the ability to learn a wide range of one-hit knockout moves, more than any other single Pokémon outside of Smeargle, which can technically learn anything. The reason Lapras can learn Sheer Cold, Fissure, and Horn Drill, 3 different one-hit knockout moves, is an oddity of its early design that was never fully explained. The most likely reason is that it was designed early enough in development that the moveset was not as carefully controlled as it became in later games, and the combination of moves stuck around through each successive generation, simply because removing them would have been a change nobody wanted to make. Lapras is the kind of Pokémon that rewards you for paying attention to it. Its design, its lore, its history, the quiet sadness and the quiet joy woven into its Pokédex entries, all of it adds up to something that feels like a complete portrait of a creature rather than a game mechanic. There are not many Pokémon in the franchise's first 151 that achieve that. Part 4. The symbiosis that should not work. Slowpoke, Slowbro, and the deeper strangeness of Slowking. Here is something interesting to consider as you settle in a little deeper. The idea of a mutually beneficial relationship in biology, what scientists call mutualism, appears throughout the Pokémon world in various forms. But no example of it is quite as specific, quite as strange, or quite as quietly unsettling as the relationship between Slowpoke and Shellder. Slowpoke is one of the most unusual Pokémon in the franchise in terms of how it is portrayed. It is a water and psychic type, which is itself an unusual combination. It has one of the most sluggish behavioral profiles of any Pokémon in the series. Its brain processes are so slow, according to the Pokédex, that it can take entire minutes for it to register pain. If it falls off a cliff, it has no immediate reaction. It tends to sit at the edge of the water with its tail dangling in, fishing for food. According to the Pokédex, the tip of its tail secretes something sweet that attracts prey, though Slowpoke itself is usually unaware of whether it has caught anything because its responses are so delayed. Slowbro, Slowpoke's most common evolution, is the result of a Shellder biting onto Slowpoke's tail while it was fishing. The Shellder, which is a bivalve Pokémon that normally lives in the sea, latched onto Slowpoke's tail and did not let go. And this single act of parasite attachment triggered Slowpoke's evolution. In game terms, Slowpoke evolves into Slowbro at level 37, which happens with no visible Shellder present. But the lore, the actual story of how this transformation occurs in the world of Pokemon, requires the bite. What makes this genuinely interesting from a biology perspective is that the relationship between Slowbro and its shelter is difficult to classify neatly. The shelter benefits because Slowpoke's tail secretes a sweet and somewhat toxic substance that the shelter happily feeds on. The shelter is also, by attaching to Slowbro, able to move through the world rather than sitting in place on the seafloor. For the shelter, this is an excellent arrangement. For Slowbro, the situation is more complicated. The shelter's bite introduces a toxin into Slowbro's tail that, according to multiple Pokedex entries, makes Slowbro incapable of feeling pain. This sounds beneficial until you consider that pain is the body's primary warning system for damage. A Slowbro that cannot feel pain cannot assess its own injuries, which is a significant vulnerability in a world full of creatures trying to eat it. However, there is a counterbalancing benefit. Slowbro, inspired in some way by the shelter's presence, becomes more capable of unleashing psychic power than it was as a plain Slowpoke. It still seems confused and dopey by most measures, but it has access to a broader range of attacks. The two creatures together are more effective than either was alone, which is the basic definition of mutualism, even if the arrangement comes with costs on both sides. Slowking takes this entire dynamic and makes it stranger. If a shelter bites Slowpoke's head instead of its tail, and if the shelter in question is held against the head by a king's rock, a different transformation occurs. The toxin enters through the head, through the skull, and instead of numbing the nervous system, it unlocks intelligence of a remarkable order. Slowking, according to the Pokedex entries from Black and White, develops intelligence comparable to award-winning scientists. The Crystal version entry describes Slowking yawning and Shelter injecting more poison into it with each yawn, each dose of toxin making it measurably more intelligent. Multiple regions have developed proverbs around Slowking's wisdom, with at least one entry noting that in some areas the phrase, "when in doubt, ask Slowking," has been in use long enough to be considered traditional. There is, however, a catch. If the shelter that has fused with Slowking's head ever comes loose, Slowking immediately forgets everything. The intelligence vanishes. All the accumulated knowledge and insight that made Slowking exceptional is gone the moment its relationship with the shelter ends. This means that everything Slowking knows, everything it can do, everything that makes it the wise advisor that entire civilizations have apparently sought out for counsel, exists only because a small bivalve creature is attached to its skull and continuously injecting it with a controlled dose of neurotoxin. That is, when you think about it carefully in the middle of a quiet night, a deeply unsettling way to be intelligent. The Galarian versions of Slowbro and Slowking, introduced in Pokemon Sword and Shield, take the strange symbiosis further still. Galarian Slowpoke spends its time eating Galarica seeds, which are local to the Galar region, and these spices build up in its body and give its tail a distinctive scent. When a Shelter bites the Galarian Slowpoke, the chemical interaction between Shelter's bite and the spice compounds in the Slowpoke's body produces a new reaction, giving the Galarian forms the poison type instead of the psychic type they carry in Kanto. Galarian Slowking is perhaps the most alarming of the group. Its shelter has almost completely engulfed the Slowpoke's head, leaving only its face visible through what looks like a heavily armored helmet made of living shell. The official description of Galarian Slowking notes that the shelter's intelligence has increased so dramatically through the Symbiosia that it now far surpasses the Slowpoke it is attached to. The incantations that Galarian Slowking has been observed making are now believed to be primarily the shelter's communication, not the Slowpoke's. The extent to which the creature underneath is still consciously present, still an active participant in its own existence, is left deliberately unclear. Slowpoke itself, through all of this, remains serenely unbothered. It has always been unbothered. That is perhaps the one stable point in the entire evolutionary line. Whatever strange thing the shelter does to it, whatever transformation occurs, Slowpoke floats along at its own pace, tail in the water, waiting for something to bite. Part 5. The Guardian Who Preferred the Deep, Lugia and the Story, Nobody Planned. There is a moment in Pokemon the Movie 2000, known in Japan as The Power of One, when Lugia surfaces from the ocean. You have seen the wings before, enormous and white, spreading above the water. but here it is fully visible for the first time. This creature that has been the subject of a prophecy running through the entire film. And what strikes you immediately is not its size, though it is enormous. What strikes you is the way it moves, with a kind of heavy, deliberate grace. The way something moves when it is extremely powerful and knows that moving carelessly could cause damage it never intended. That quality, enormous power held back by its own awareness of what it could do, is the defining characteristic of Lugia, and it shapes everything about how the Pokemon exists in the world. Lugia is the mascot of Pokemon Silver, the guardian of the sea, the diving Pokemon. It is a psychic and flying type, which is unusual for a creature so strongly associated with water. It is not a water type at all, despite the fact that it lives deep in the ocean, despite the fact that it is the natural counterpart of Ho-Oh in the same way that water and fire are counterparts, despite the fact that its catch location in Gold and Silver is a sea cave in the Whirl Islands surrounded by whirlpools. The psychic and flying typing exists because the designers at Game Freak wanted Lugia to be competitively viable in a different way from a pure water type. And the choice has always given Lugia a slightly mysterious quality, a creature that does not fit cleanly into a category which suits it perfectly. The story of how Lugia came into existence is genuinely strange, and it is worth knowing. Lugia was not originally a Game Freak creation. The character was designed by Takeshi Shudo, the chief writer of the original Pokemon anime series and the first 3 Pokemon movies. Shudo created Lugia as the central figure for what would become Pokemon the Movie 2000, and he designed it before Gold and Silver were being developed publicly. The design was drawn by Ken Sugimori, but the concept and the creative direction were Shudo's, and Shudo had a very specific vision for what Lugia was. He saw it as a guardian of the sea, a creature of tremendous power that had chosen isolation as a form of responsibility. He wanted it to be female. He wanted to focus the movie on Lugia and the villain Lawrence III, without Ash and Team Rocket, a direction that was rejected by executives. When Gold and Silver were being developed, the decision was made to include Lugia as the version mascot of Silver, which meant it needed to appear in the games. This surprised Shudo, according to accounts he wrote about the experience later. The Lugia he had created for a film became a legendary Pokemon that millions of players would encounter in a sea cave after collecting 2 Silver Wings. But the version of Lugia in the games received psychic and flying typing instead of being associated with water, and it received a male voice in the film despite Shudo's intention that it be female. Shudo wrote about these changes with evident pain. He had built something that felt true to him and watched it be adjusted into something slightly different by the collaborative machinery of a commercial franchise. Shudo passed away in 2010. His legacy in the Pokemon franchise, which includes the entire tone and emotional texture of the early anime series, the way Ash's journey felt hopeful rather than commercial, the way Team Rocket were written with a surprising degree of pathos and comedy simultaneously, all of that endures. And Lugia, the creature he built from the idea of enormous power holding itself back from the world, still lives in the deepest part of the Whirl Islands, waiting in the dark and the cold and the silence for someone worthy enough to find it. The Pokédex entries for Lugia describe it in terms that are almost religious in their reverence. A light flutter of Lugia's wings can cause winds strong enough to tear a house apart. If it were to flap its wings with full force, the resulting storms could last for 40 days. Because it is aware of what it can do, it chooses to live at the bottom of deep oceanic trenches, where it spends most of its existence in solitude, asleep. This is not weakness. This is a kind of ethical restraint that most creatures, including most humans, do not possess. Lugia has the power to remake the weather and chooses to sleep at the bottom of the sea instead. Lugia's competitive stats reflect this portrait of restrained power. It has a base stat total of 680, placing it firmly among the most powerful Pokemon in the game. Its defense and special defense are both exceptional, making it one of the hardest Pokemon to remove from the field through direct damage. Its signature move is Aeroblast, a flying-type attack with a notably high critical hit rate. And its hidden ability, Multiscale, reduces all incoming damage by half when Lugia is at full health, meaning the first hit it takes from any attack does 50% of what it would otherwise do. Getting past Lugia's defenses in full health is an exercise in sustained, methodical attrition. You cannot simply overpower it. This mechanically reflects the lore with a precision that the franchise does not always achieve. A creature that chooses isolation over dominance, that limits its own movement to avoid causing collateral damage, that can only be found at the center of a whirlpool maze in a remote island chain, should be difficult to face and difficult to hurt. And it is. In Pokemon Gold and Silver lore, Lugia was once said to reside in the Brass Tower in Ecruteak City, before that tower burned down 150 years before the events of the games. The fire that destroyed the Brass Tower killed 3 unnamed Pokemon inside it, and Ho-Oh, devastated by the loss, resurrected those 3 Pokemon as the legendary beasts, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. After the tower burned, Lugia moved to the Whirl Islands. The connection between Lugia, the burned tower, and the legendary beasts creates a web of mythology in the Johto region that is more elaborate and more emotionally resonant than anything in the Kanto games that preceded it. And Lugia's Pokédex number is 249. Not a round number, not a number that sits at any particularly notable point in the sequence. Just 249, a prime number, a number that divides only by itself and one which seems fitting, in a way, for a creature that prefers solitude. Part 6, The North Wind with a Gentle Face. Suicune, the Qilin, and the Burned Tower's Legacy. Let us slow down even further for this one. There is a creature in Chinese and Japanese mythology called the Qilin. It is often described as a chimeric animal, combining elements of multiple creatures into a single form, covered in scales or sometimes in flames, with the hooves of a deer and the face of a dragon. It has been depicted differently across different dynasties and different cultural traditions, but certain qualities have remained consistent across nearly every telling. The Qilin appears only in times of peace, only before those who are pure of heart. A sage or a righteous ruler might see one. Someone consumed by ambition or driven by selfishness never will. The Qilin walks lightly enough that it does not bend the grass beneath its feet. It causes no harm to any living thing. Suicune is the Qilin of the Pokemon world. This is not a fan theory. The parallels are specific enough and extensive enough to constitute clear design intent. Suicune is the blue legendary beast, the one associated with water, the one that embodies the rain that extinguished the fire of the burned tower. In Pokemon Crystal, Suicune does not roam the Johto region the way Raikou and Entei do. Instead, it appears in specific locations, waiting. And each time it appears before the player, the protagonist, who is described multiple times throughout the games as someone pure of heart. Yucine, the character in Crystal who has dedicated his life to pursuing Suicune, a genuine enthusiast and researcher who has spent years trying to find it, is never able to catch up to it. It slips away from him every time. Because his desire, his ambition to catch Suicune, is itself the quality that makes him unworthy of it. This is exactly how the Qilin behaves in classical mythology. Suicune is also described, in multiple Pokédex entries, as a Pokémon that purifies dirty water as it travels. It is the north wind given form, bringing the chill of winter and clarity to stagnant and polluted water wherever it passes. In the Pokemon world, where water is the element of life in the same way it is in the real world, a Pokemon that cleans water as it walks is not merely a powerful legendary, it is a necessity. It is something the world needs, functioning quietly in the background, making things better for creatures who will never know it was there. Suicune's design reinforces all of this. Its purple mane streams behind it like smoke or running water. The crystal formation on its forehead is diamond-shaped and blue. Its body is lean and deliberately feminine in comparison to the more aggressive, powerfully built profiles of Entei and Raikou. The Qilin in Chinese tradition is associated with femininity, described as being less aggressive and less fanged than the creatures it is compared to. Suicune fits. In Pokemon Colosseum, when the legendary beasts are captured as shadow Pokemon and must be purified, Suicune is the only one taken from a female trainer. It is the mascot for the only Generation 2 game that allowed players to use a female avatar, Pokemon Crystal. These are design choices that accumulate into a coherent portrait. The origin story of the legendary beasts, as established in Gold and Silver and expanded in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, begins with a fire. 150 years before the player arrives in Johto, the brass tower in Ecruteak City was struck by lightning and burned. 3 unnamed Pokemon were inside the tower and could not escape. They died in the flames. Ho-Oh, the legendary Pokemon associated with resurrection and fire, was moved by their deaths and used its power to bring them back, giving them new forms that reflected the different aspects of the catastrophe. Raikou embodies the lightning that started the fire. Entei embodies the fire itself. Suicune embodies the rain that came down afterwards and put the flames out. Each of the 3 legendary beasts, then, is a memorial. They carry the memory of a disaster in their very nature, transformed from grief and loss into something that persists across the landscape of Johto, present but never quite catchable, running ahead of the player with the same elusiveness as a memory you cannot quite hold. Suicune's particular aspect of this, the rain that extinguished the flames, is the gentlest of the 3. It is not the cause of the catastrophe, it is not the catastrophe itself. It is the thing that came after, the thing that cooled and quieted and put an end to the destruction. It is the response to grief rather than the source of it. That is why Suicune is the one associated with purity. Water washes things clean. Rain after a fire is one of the oldest and most universal symbols of restoration. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Suicune is given a unique encounter structure that no other legendary beast receives. After the burned tower, rather than simply roaming the Johto map, Suicune appears at multiple specific locations before finally allowing the player to battle it. Each appearance is a kind of test, an assessment of whether the player has the patience and the persistence to meet a creature that does not come to just anyone. The final encounter happens at the Tin Tower, once brass, and once the perch of both Ho-Oh and Lugia, the sacred place that the disaster was built around. It is almost a pilgrimage. And then you throw a Pokeball and it works, or it does not, and you save your game either way and Suicune becomes yours. But for a moment before that, if you have been paying attention to everything the game has been telling you, there is something extraordinary about standing face to face with a mythological guardian that crossed a continent to meet you, that waded through every failed encounter, that chose you specifically in a way that it chose no one else in the story. Suicune in competitive Pokemon is something worth noting separately from its lore, because the 2 dimensions of the character align more closely than they sometimes do. Suicune's defensive stats are extraordinary. Its special defense is its highest stat, and its physical defense is nearly as high. It can learn Calm Mind, an attack that raises both its special attack and special defense simultaneously, and if given enough turns and enough defensive support, a Suicune with several Calm Minds stacked is genuinely difficult to remove. It moves slowly, and it endures, and it gradually becomes something that cannot be shifted. This maps perfectly onto the mythology, something pure and patient and fundamentally unmovable, that becomes more of itself over time rather than less. Suicune also demonstrates one of the more interesting design symmetries in the Johto region. The 3 legendary beasts each represent a different relationship with the disaster they came from. Raikou is restless, roaming quickly, unpredictable, carrying the energy of the lightning strike that started everything. Entei is fierce, erupting, associated with volcanoes and transformation through fire. Suicune is still. It moves deliberately. It appears before the worthy and waits for them. It embodies the moment after the disaster, when the rain comes down and the fires go out, and the ground begins to cool and something like peace becomes possible again. In the animated special, Suicune and Ash from the Pokemon Chronicles series, Suicune briefly appears in the anime as a powerful and wholly free creature, one that observes trainers in the natural world with equal detachment, touching neither permanently, passing through both like the wind it embodies. It helps where it chooses. It cannot be commanded, it can barely be found. And when it has done what it came to do, it simply leaves, moving on to the next place that needs what it carries. Suicune, the North Wind, the purifier of water, the Keelan. The water type has given us many things. It has given us Gyarados burning through the ruins of ancient cities and Milotic calming them afterward. It has given us Lapras singing in the polar dark for pods it cannot always find. It has given us Vaporeon dissolving into clean water and Wishiwashi assembling into something enormous from nothing. It has given us Lugia sleeping at the bottom of the sea to keep the storms inside itself. And it has given us Suicune, walking without bending the grass, appearing only to those pure of heart, running ahead of every would-be catcher until the moment it decides the person behind it has earned the encounter. These are not just game mechanics. These are ideas. Ideas about patience and power and transformation and peace. Ideas that an enormous franchise built around a children's card game managed to carry forward for 30 years without losing the thread. That is not nothing. That is actually quite remarkable. Part 7. The Beauty That Lives at the Bottom. Milotic, Feebas, and the hardest evolution in the franchise. Let us talk about patience, since that has become something of an ongoing theme in this journey through the water type. Feebas is one of the most deliberately unglamorous Pokemon ever designed. It is a flat, brown, dull-looking fish with mismatched scales and a generally disheveled appearance. Its Pokédex entries are unsparing about this. It is described as the shabbiest Pokemon in history. Predators ignore it not because it is well hidden, but because it genuinely does not seem worth the trouble. Its smell apparently discourages attack. It survives in polluted water, in drainage ditches, in shallow tide pools that better adapted fish would never go near because Feebas is extraordinarily tough and extraordinarily willing to make do. Finding a Feebas in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire required fishing in one of exactly 6 specific tiles on Route 119, a long waterway with hundreds of fishable spots. The tiles changed each day. There was no visual indicator of which tiles contained Feebas. Players had to fish systematically across the entire route, checking each spot, trying to catch a Pokemon that looked like nothing and had stats to match, in the hope that it would eventually become something worth having. And then, once you had it, evolving it required maximizing something called the beauty condition. A contest stat raised by feeding your Phoebus-specific poke blocks made from blue, indigo, or a handful of other berries, calculated from a system most players never fully understood. You needed not just a high beauty stat, but a maximum one, and the process of raising it through the contest system was time-consuming and not obviously signposted for players who were just trying to play the main story. Many players who caught a Phoebus simply gave up before it evolved. It was too obscure, too involved, too disconnected from everything else the game was asking them to do. Players who persisted got Milotic. Milotic is described by the Pokemon world's own in-universe sources as the most beautiful Pokemon in existence. Not one of the most beautiful, the most beautiful. Its scales are described as rainbow-colored, shifting hue depending on the angle from which they are viewed. Its long red hair-like appendages drift behind it as it moves. Its body is serpentine and cream-colored, and it glows a vivid pink when it uses its most powerful abilities. The Pokédex entries across generations say that glimpsing a Milotic is enough to calm any hostile emotion, that it has appeared in times of war to pacify combatants, that its appearance has been depicted in paintings and sculptures throughout history, and that artists have been inspired by it for as long as anyone can remember. Milotic is described not just as beautiful, but as pacifying. It is a peacemaker on an almost mythological scale, a creature that calms conflict simply by existing inside of it. This is a remarkable quality to assign to a Pokemon that evolves from the ugliest fish in the game. The game's most prominent use of Milotic as a character is through the gym leader and champion Wallace, who appears in Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. In Ruby and Sapphire, Wallace is the leader of Sotopolis Gym, a water-type specialist who uses Milotic as his ace Pokemon. In Emerald, he is promoted to champion. Wallace is portrayed as both a coordinator and a battler, interested in the aesthetic dimensions of Pokemon as much as their combat power, and his choice of Milotic as his signature Pokemon reflects that. A trainer who cares about beauty and refinement uses the Pokemon described as the most beautiful in existence. The pairing is thematically coherent in a way that the games do not always achieve. In the Pokemon Adventures manga, Phoebus has one of the most emotionally resonant evolution arcs in the series. The character Ruby, who is obsessed with Pokemon beauty contests and entirely uninterested in battle, reluctantly accepts a Phoebus who has taken a liking to him. He names her Fifi, and he finds her repulsive. The evolution of Fifi into Milotic happens at a point in the story where Ruby is being forced to confront the limitations of judging worth by appearance, and the trigger for the evolution is Ruby genuinely acknowledging, for the first time, that Fifi has inner beauty, regardless of what she looks like. This is not a subtle narrative. It is doing exactly what you think it is doing, but it does it with enough sincerity that it works, and Milotic's introduction in that arc lands with real weight. The design parallel with Gyarados and Magikarp is both obvious and intentional. Both lines consist of a deeply unimpressive fish that becomes a powerful serpentine water type. But where Gyarados is the embodiment of rage and destruction, Milotic is the embodiment of beauty and peace. Where Gyarados appears during times of war and burns ruins in its wake, Milotic appears during times of war and soothes the people fighting. They share the same base stat total of 540. They share the same HP, defense, and speed stats. Their attack and special attack values are identical, just distributed to opposite sides of the split between physical and special. Milotic and Gyarados are mirrors of each other, one terrible and one transcendent. Both arrived at through patience, but through different kinds of patience. Gyarados requires the patience of grinding, of pushing a useless Pokemon through levels until the level 20 transformation happens. It is endurance for its own sake, the willingness to be bored, and continue anyway. Milotic requires the patience of understanding a system you were not explicitly told about, of caring for something that gives you nothing in return until the moment it gives you everything. It is care rather than endurance, attention rather than persistence. The fact that Generation 5 simplified Milotic's evolution by allowing Phoebus to evolve through trading while holding a prism scale means that newer players never had to go through the original contest system at all. The beauty of the evolution, its difficulty, the way it asked you to understand something obscure and commit to it, was smoothed away in the interest of accessibility. This is neither good nor bad, it is just a reflection of how the franchise has changed over the years, becoming more welcoming and less willing to lock content behind systems that players might never find. But for those who evolved a Milotic in the original Ruby and Sapphire, who figured out the Pokeblock system from scratch, or from a tip in a magazine, or from a friend at school who had somehow worked it out, the moment the evolution completed had a specific quality that most Pokemon evolutions never achieved. It felt earned. It felt like the game was acknowledging something about you, about your willingness to go beyond what was obvious and necessary, and find the beautiful thing waiting at the end of it. That is what Milotic has always been. An argument for paying attention. An argument for caring about what seems unworthy of care. Part 8. The jellyfish that runs the ocean. Tentacool, Tentacruel, and the sea's forgotten guardians. If you played Pokemon Red or Blue as a child, you almost certainly remember the exact moment you first surfed on the open ocean routes and encountered your first Tentacool, and your second, and your 23rd. Tentacool is one of the most abundant wild Pokemon in the original games. On the open water routes between cities, encounter rates for Tentacool ran as high as 60% in some areas. You could not cross the ocean without meeting dozens of them. They became a kind of ambient presence, a texture of the sea rather than an individual creature, which is actually quite accurate to the behavior of real jellyfish, which often form blooms of hundreds or thousands of individuals that fill the water with translucent bells and trailing tendrils. The design of Tentacool and Tentacruel draws from multiple sources. Tentacruel is based on a jellyfish, but with elements of squid in the way its tentacles are described and the way it hunts, and there are specific Pokédex entries that read almost like a catalog of terror. Tentacruel has 80 tentacles in total, though most of them are kept short and only about 14 are typically visible. When it hunts, it extends all 80 simultaneously, creating a net-like structure that can immobilize up to 80 prey simultaneously. Its red orbs glow to communicate with others of its kind, can refract sunlight and store energy, and, when agitated, emit ultrasonic waves capable of causing rough water for a significant radius around it. Tentacruel's Pokédex entries state that when large outbreaks of them occur, all fish Pokémon disappear from the surrounding sea. That detail, that every other fish retreats when Tentacruel gather in numbers, is quietly staggering. This is not a creature that exists at the bottom of the food chain. This is an apex predator of the Pokemon Ocean, and the only reason most players underestimate it is because they first met its baby form as a nuisance on their way to somewhere else. The anime explored a side of Tentacruel that the games hinted at, but never made explicit. In an early Indigo League episode, a construction project begins building a hotel on a coral reef that serves as a tentacle habitat. In response to the destruction of their territory, a massive Tentacruel attacks Porta Vista, the coastal city nearby. What makes the episode unusual is the framing. The Tentacruel is not simply a monster, it is defending something. It speaks through Meowth to explain that the construction has destroyed the home of Tentacool, that the humans building the hotel gave no thought to what was already there. The Pokemon is angry because it has reason to be angry. For a 1997 anime episode aimed at children, this is a surprisingly clear environmental message, delivered through a creature that could have been presented as pure villain, and instead was given a grievance that the audience was clearly meant to understand, if not fully endorse. Tentacool's Pokedex entries carry a detail that has always struck players who noticed it. Tentacool's body is composed of 99% water. The remaining 1% is the organ that produces its poison. If Tentacool is removed from the water, it shrivels like parchment and dehydrates rapidly. The Pokedex even notes that if you find one dried out on the beach, you should throw it back. This gives Tentacool a strange fragility despite the danger it poses. The thing that fills the ocean routes and stings every surfer that crosses them is itself completely dependent on the water. Take it out of its element, and it becomes almost nothing. There is something meditative in that image. The creature that blocks your path and demands your attention across every ocean crossing is the same creature that desiccates helplessly on a dry beach. Power and vulnerability existing in the same small, translucent body. Part 9. All Alone and Enormous. Wishiwashi and the Lesson of the Smallest Fish. Solo Form. Wishiwashi has the lowest base stat total of any Pokemon at 175. Let that settle for a moment. 175. Sunkern, previously the record holder for lowest stats, sits at 180. Wishiwashi Solo Form is weaker by any numerical measure than the weakest Pokemon in the entire franchise. It is a tiny, sad-looking fish with large, tearful eyes and stats that reflect exactly what its name suggests. Wishiwashi, weak, barely there. School Form. Wishiwashi has a base stat total of 620. The transformation happens when Wishiwashi reaches level 20 and enters battle with more than 25% of its health remaining. Its eyes begin to shine with a bioluminescent signal that is visible, according to the Pokedex, from up to 25 miles away. Other Wishiwashi respond to that signal. They come from everywhere, gathering to the call in numbers that the Alolan people have estimated at roughly 262 individuals per school. And together, swimming in perfect coordination, they form a shape that is no longer a collection of small fish. In its school form, Wishiwashi resembles a submarine, or possibly the extinct prehistoric fish Dunkleosteus, which was one of the largest armored fish that ever lived. Or possibly Kyogre, the legendary water type that represents the ocean itself. In the game, before you understand what you are dealing with, the trial at Brooklet Hill builds toward an encounter that is framed as though you are about to face something enormous and legendary. And when school form Wishiwashi finally appears, the visual payoff of that buildup is remarkable for a Pokemon that is, underneath all of that coordinated mass, a collection of tiny crying fish. The schooling ability that makes this transformation possible is unique to Wishiwashi. No other Pokemon has it. The mechanics are interesting in a way that raises questions the games never fully answer. When Wishiwashi is in school form, is the Pokemon you are battling technically one Pokemon or many? If you knock it below 25% health and it reverts to solo form, where do all the other Wishiwashi go? Are they still present somewhere off-screen, retreating from the fight? Are they simply gone? The answers to these questions are left open, which gives Wishiwashi a quality that most Pokemon do not have. It is a concept with implications that extend beyond the game it appears in. The real-world inspiration for Wishiwashi's schooling behavior comes from the actual behavior of small forage fish, species like sardines and anchovies that gather in enormous schools to create a collective predator deterrence effect. A single sardine is trivial prey. A school of 10,000 sardines moving as one unit is a different proposition. A mass of bodies with complex internal communication creating the impression of a single enormous creature. This is a genuine survival strategy, and Wishiwashi turns it into a battle mechanic. There is also something appealing about the emotional story embedded in Wishiwashi's design. Its solo form has eyes that look perpetually on the verge of tears. Its name contains Wishiwashi, implying indecision and weakness. It is individually absolutely nothing. But it calls out, and others come, and together they become something that makes legendary Pokemon flee. The Pokédex notes that even Gyarados, which we have already discussed at some length, will flee when it encounters a school of Wishiwashi in Alolan waters. The atrocious Pokémon, the destroyer of cities, the dragon that burns everything, retreats from a collection of small fish that are crying. That is a remarkable fact to sit with. There is one more thing about Wishiwashi worth noting. The way it calls for help uses bioluminescence, light produced by a living organism, a mechanism used by hundreds of real deep-sea creatures. Anglerfish use it to lure prey. Fireflies use it to communicate across fields at night. Certain bacteria produce it in the bellies of squid. Bioluminescence is one of the more beautiful facts about the natural world. Light generated not by sun or fire or electricity, but by chemistry, by living things deciding to glow. Wishiwashi's version of this is a signal that travels 25 miles through open water, carrying a message to every Wishiwashi in range. The message is simple: I need help. And they come. There is a whole argument about individualism and collectivism embedded in Wishiwashi's design that the games never make explicitly. Solo form Wishiwashi is genuinely, statistically, the weakest Pokemon that exists. But the question Wishiwashi asks is not, what am I alone? The question is, what can I become when I ask for help and help arrives? And the answer to that question, 620 base stats and a form that makes legendary Pokemon turn and swim away as fast as they can, is one of the most direct arguments the Pokemon franchise has ever made for the value of community over individual capability. In a franchise built entirely around the idea of becoming stronger, of growing and evolving and pushing past your limitations through training and effort and the bonds between a trainer and their Pokemon, Wishiwashi's message arrives from an unexpected direction. You do not have to be strong alone, you just have to know how to call and trust that something will answer. Part 10. Every water starter from the turtle to the duck, a generation-by-generation journey. From the very first moment the Pokemon franchise asked you to make a choice, the water starter was one of the three options. In every generation, in every numbered region, a water type has been presented to the player as one of the foundational Pokemon of their journey. The fire type burns forward, the grass type endures, and the water type flows around every obstacle, adapts to every challenge, and carries you across the places you cannot cross on your own. This is the story of every water starter. Squirtle was the water starter of Generation 1, Pokemon Red and Blue, 1996. It is a small blue turtle with a round body and a curly tail, and it evolves into Wartortle and then Blastoise, a massive bipedal turtle that carries two enormous water cannons mounted on its shell. Squirtle's design is deceptively simple. The round body, the large eyes, the tiny claws, all of it reads as deliberately cute without being saccharine. The evolution into Blastoise is appropriately dramatic. What begins as a charming pocket-sized turtle becomes a 1.6-meter armored tank capable of blasting water with enough force to pierce steel. The cannons are not ornamental. Blastoise's attack stat is legitimate and its water-type moves hit hard. In the anime, Ash's Squirtle was introduced as the leader of a gang called the Squirtle Squad, a group of abandoned Squirtle who wore sunglasses and were technically delinquents before Ash won their trust. This backstory gave Ash's Squirtle an instant personality that most of his other Pokemon never had from the beginning, a swagger and a history and a reason for its particular kind of loyalty. The Squirtle Squad eventually became firefighters, which is exactly the kind of narrative circularity that works in a children's franchise without trying too hard. Totodile followed in Generation 2, the water starter of Johto in Gold and Silver. Where Squirtle was round and calm, Totodile was energetic and slightly unhinged. Its defining trait is a set of extremely powerful jaws that it cannot always control, leading to an affectionate habit of biting things it has no reason to bite, including its trainer. The Pokédex is explicit that even experienced trainers should be careful around Totodile, noting that its jaws are powerful enough to cause serious injury even in friendly gestures. Ash's Totodile in the anime was exactly what this description implied, biting everything with apparent joy and no apparent malice, dancing when it was pleased, grinning constantly. Feraligatr, Totodile's final form, is one of the more underappreciated final evolutions in the franchise. It is a large, muscular, crocodile-type creature that moves slowly on land, but is described as explosively fast in the water, capable of sudden bursts of speed that stun prey by their abruptness. Its name has a typo baked into it permanently, the result of Generation 2's 10-character name limit, forcing a contraction that never quite looks right. Feraligatr. Not Feraligatr as in the animal. Feraligatr as in we ran out of characters. This is a small piece of franchise history embedded in every Pokédex entry the Pokémon ever received. Mudkip was the Generation 3 water starter in Ruby and Sapphire, and it became something of a phenomenon in early internet Pokémon culture that far outpaced its actual role in the games. The phrase, "So I heard, you leak Mudkips," became one of the earliest and most widely recognized Pokémon-adjacent internet memes, originating from forums in the early 2000s and persisting long enough that many players who were not yet born when the game came out are still aware of it. Mudkip itself is orange-finned, blue-bodied, and has a star-shaped pattern on its cheeks that functions as a sensory fin for detecting vibrations in air and water. It can smash large boulders. It evolves into Marshtomp and then Swampert, a powerful water and ground type combination that is weak only to grass type attacks. Swampert's Mega Evolution, introduced in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, is one of the more visually dramatic Mega forms in the franchise, transforming Swampert's already bulky frame into something massive and dripping, with waterfall-like cascades of material on its arms that suggest either water or hair or both simultaneously. Mega Swampert's primary competitive use was on rain teams, where its swift swim ability doubled its speed in rain, turning a normally slow defensive Pokémon into a sweeper that moved faster than almost anything else in the game. Piplup was Generation 4's contribution, a blue penguin who evolves into Prinplup and then Empoleon, the only water and steel dual type in the franchise. Steel is one of the most defensively valuable types in competitive Pokémon, resistant to 10 different attack types, and adding it to water creates a combination with very few weaknesses and enormous defensive coverage. Empoleon looks like a Napoleonic emperor penguin, which is exactly what the design is going for, trident-shaped chest markings and all. Dawn's Piplup in the Sinnoh anime series became one of the more memorable anime Pokémon companions of its era, characterized by enormous pride and a stubborn refusal to be overlooked, which led to comedic situations throughout the series and gave it a personality that distinguished it clearly from Ash's Pikachu, while borrowing the same basic dynamic of an extremely small Pokémon with an outsized sense of its own importance. Oshawott in Generation 5 was the water starter of Unova, a small otter Pokémon carrying a Scalchop on its belly, a small shell that it uses as a blade. Its evolution into Dewett and then Samurott is one of the more dramatic visual shifts in starter evolution history. Oshawott and Dewett are both bipedal, reading as anthropomorphic in the way many Pokémon do. Samurott drops to all fours and becomes an enormous sea lion-type creature in samurai armor, with swords called scimitars incorporated into its leg armor. The shift from cute bipedal otter to quadrupedal armored sea lion confused players who were expecting a more linear visual progression, but it has its defenders, and the Hisuian regional form of Samurott, introduced in Pokémon Legends Arceus, returned Samurott to a more refined samurai aesthetic with a darker, sharper design that has become popular in its own right. Froakie in Generation 6, Kalos's water starter, became one of the most beloved starters in the franchise's recent history, largely because of its anime incarnation. Ash's Greninja, Froakie's final evolution, developed a unique ability in the anime called Ash Greninja, a bond form that pushed the boundary of what trainer-Pokémon relationships could look like and became the central narrative thread of the entire Kalos saga. Greninja itself is a water and dark dual type, A frog ninja with a tongue scarf and an attack pattern that emphasizes speed above almost everything else. Its final pre-release appearance in the Pokemon anime before Ash departed the series was one of the more emotionally resonant farewells in recent seasons. Poplio in Generation 7 began with the most difficult public reception of any modern water starter. Its circus seal design, with its nose bubble and its cheerful, clumsy energy, struck some players as too silly or too feminine for the aesthetic they expected. The evolution line's final form, Primarina, answered every concern by becoming one of the most elegantly designed water and fairy type Pokemon in the franchise. A mermaid-like performer with extraordinary stat distribution and a signature move called Sparkling Aria. Poplio's evolution line is frequently cited as one of the strongest aesthetic arcs in the starter family. The progression from comedic to genuinely beautiful being, handled with more care than almost any other line that begins with a design that fails to impress. Sobble in Generation 8 was the water starter of Galar, and its design is built entirely around anxiety. It is a lizard that cries when frightened, and its tears are chemically similar to 100 raw onions in potency, meaning anyone nearby also starts crying. It is shy, fragile, and desperately easy to feel protective of. Its final evolution, Inteleon, is a tall, angular spy lizard with a single-shot sniper capability and a dramatically different energy from the weeping chameleon it started as. The contrast between the vulnerable base form and the competent, precise final form gives Sobble's line a character arc embedded in its design. Quaxley in Generation 9 began the newest era of water starters. A duck with a hairstyle maintained by an oil-like substance produced by its feathers, which also serves as a water repellent. Its evolution line leads into a dancer, and Quaquaval's final design, with its flowing movement and its carnival-inspired color scheme, represents a distinct creative direction for the water type that deliberately moves away from the aquatic emphasis of most water starters towards something more performative and celebratory. Each of these choices, from Squirtle's round reliability to Quaxley's dancing ambition, tells a story about what the design teams valued at the time they were made. The water starter is always present, always reliable, always there at the beginning to ask the question that the whole franchise is built on. Which path do you want to take? What kind of story do you want to tell? Part 11. The Deep End. Scattered depths of the water type. We are coming toward the end now, and the night is deep, and there are still things worth saying slowly, things worth carrying into sleep. The water type has produced some of the most quietly haunting Pokédex entries in the franchise's history. Certain entries have a quality that sticks in the memory long after you have set the game down. Not because they are terrifying in the way that Drifloon's entries about kidnapping children are terrifying, but because they describe the world in ways that are quietly extraordinary if you take the time to read them properly. Take Clawitzer, the water type introduced in Generation 6, whose claw functions as a cannon that uses compressed water to fire projectiles. A fully charged shot from Clawitzer can pierce through the hull of a large tanker ship. This is not a legendary. This is a shrimp. Take Dragalge, the water and poison type from the same generation, described as capable of dissolving the hull of an oil tanker with its acid. It hides among rotting seaweed and waits for prey to drift past, so patient and so still that sailors would regularly confuse it for vegetation until they are already in trouble. Take Delmise, the ghost and grass-type anchor Pokemon that is technically made of seaweed that has accumulated around a ship's anchor and developed a form of consciousness. It is not the anchor. The anchor is just the part you can see. The seaweed is the Pokemon, and it hunts by whipping its anchor at prey hard enough to knock ships off course. Take Palossand, the ghost and ground-type sandcastle Pokemon, whose Pokédex entries note that it drags small Pokemon underground beneath the sand and absorbs their life force, leaving hollow, dried-out shells behind. Palossand is a sandcastle at a beach. Children build sandcastles. The implication is left sitting there quietly in the Pokédex entry, and nobody in the franchise seems particularly troubled by it. None of these are water types, but they live in and around water. They are part of the world that the water type inhabits, and they contribute to the sense that the Pokemon Ocean is a place where remarkable and sometimes quietly terrible things are happening just below the surface at all times. Manaphy, the mythical water type introduced in Generation 4, has the ability to swap the spirits of any two Pokemon or people it touches. transferring their consciousnesses between bodies. This is described in its Pokédex entries almost as a gift, a form of empathy, the ability to understand another creature's experience by living briefly inside it. But it is also an ability that, if you think about it in the middle of a quiet night, raises significant questions about what consent looks like in a world where one of the Pokémon can reach into you and swap you with someone else. Wailord, the enormous floating whale Pokémon, is the largest Pokémon by length in the franchise at 14.5 meters. It is lighter than air for its size, which means it floats when it breaches. And the image of something that large leaving the water entirely and hovering for a moment before coming back down is one of the more spectacular things any Pokémon is described as doing. It lives deep in the ocean, where the water pressure would kill a human in seconds, surfacing only to breathe. The community has calculated, based on its official size and weight stats, that Wailord would be less dense than the air we breathe. A fact that has generated considerable amusement and considerable genuine confusion about whether this was intentional or a scaling error in the data. Nobody has confirmed either way. Relicanth is a water-dwelling fossil Pokémon, a living relic designed after the Coelacanth, a fish that was believed to have gone extinct 65 million years ago until living specimens were discovered off the coast of South Africa in 1938. The Coelacanth's discovery was one of the great scientific shocks of the 20th century. A creature that science had classified as gone forever, suddenly reappearing in the present. Relicanth carries that resonance directly. Its Pokédex describes it as unchanged for 100 million years. A creature that has seen the rise and fall of everything above it and continues to exist unchanged, swimming in the same cold, deep water with the same body that swam there when the continents were shaped differently. There is something profoundly calming about Relicanth when you sit with it. Everything changes. Regions rise and fall. Civilizations build their towers and burn them. Legendary Pokémon come and go. And Relicanth swims in the same dark water it has always swum in, looking exactly the way it looked before any of the things we care about existed. Unchanged. Unhurried. Still here. Phione, the smaller related Pokémon to Manaphy, is interesting for an entirely different reason. It is technically a mythical Pokémon, but it has never been treated with the reverence that mythical status usually implies. You could breed one from Manaphy with Ditto, which no other mythical Pokémon in the franchise could produce through breeding. You could catch multiple. It felt like a compromise, a mythical that was actually accessible, which sat awkwardly with fans who associated mythical status with absolute rarity. The debate about whether Phione truly deserves its mythical designation has never fully been settled, and the Pokémon Company has occasionally seemed unsure how to handle it. There is Alomomola, the Generation 5 water type that looks like a heart and heals wounded Pokémon it encounters in the ocean, wrapping them in its fins and carrying them carefully to safety. There is no evolutionary relationship between Alomomola and Luvdisc, despite the visual similarity. That was either a decision to make Luvdisc feel more special or a decision made early in development and never revisited. Alomomola is independently one of the most straightforwardly kind Pokémon in the franchise. Its reason for existing, according to the Pokédex, is to find injured Pokémon and help them. That is the entire entry. It finds the hurt ones and brings them home. There is Kingdra, the evolved form of Horsia and Seadra, a water and dragon type that lives at the extreme bottom of the ocean in a sealed cave. When it wakes from sleep, the sudden turbulence it creates is described as being powerful enough to generate ocean whirlpools on the surface miles above it. Kingdra sleeps to avoid accidentally destroying the world around it, which is a motif that appears in several water-type legendaries as well. The idea of a powerful creature choosing rest as a form of responsibility. There is Mantine, the water and flying type based on a manta ray, gentle and enormous, which in the Alola games serves as a surfing vehicle that players can ride between islands, performing tricks off waves to earn points. The image of traveling between sun-drenched tropical islands on the back of a manta ray is one of the most effortlessly beautiful things the Pokémon franchise has ever managed to build into gameplay. And it fits Alola's island geography in a way that feels genuinely designed for the region, rather than inserted from somewhere else. There is Pyukumuku, the Generation 7 Pokémon based on a sea cucumber, which when threatened does not flee or fight, but instead punches with its own internal organs, extruding them through its mouth to deliver the attack. Fishermen throw them back into the sea when they wash ashore. Pukamuku always crawls back, loyal to a particular stretch of water in a way that most people would describe as habit, but the Pokédex describes as devotion. The same stretch of water, every time, no matter how many times it is removed. There is Primarina's song, which is not just decorative but functional. The water bubbles it manipulates in performance, all controlled by precise vocal notes, each bubble shaped and moved by a different pitch. It rehearses through the night and performs on the surface of the water at dawn, and the sound carries across the open sea. Primarina's Pokédex entries note that a Primarina who stops singing will eventually become unable to use its abilities at all. The song is not optional. The song is the Primarina. There is Corsola, the quiet reef-building Pokémon from Generation 2, who in Galar has a ghost-type regional form because the warm waters Corsola lived in have become too cold and acidic due to environmental changes, and all the Corsola in Galar died, and what are left are their pale, hollow ghosts still living in the shape of the creatures they once were, still following the routines of a living Pokémon. The Galarian Corsola's Pokédex entry says that it absorbs the life force of any Pokémon that touches its branches, and that it wanders aimlessly. It is the shape of something that used to live. It remembers living without knowing how to stop behaving as though it still does. That one is worth sitting with for a moment. There is Gastrodon in its two forms, East Sea and West Sea, different colors of the same species separated by geographic distribution, which is a detail drawn directly from real cephalopod and mollusk biology, where populations separated by landmasses develop different regional coloring over time. There is Luminion, the neon-colored deep-sea fish Pokémon, that uses the patterns on its fins to lure prey based on anglerfish and other bioluminescent predators of the deep. There is Lantern, the water and electric type whose luminous appendage hangs above its head like the lure of an actual anglerfish, drawing prey toward a mouth that closes before they realize the light was a trap. And underneath all of it, underneath the mythology and the competitive stats and the anime appearances and the Pokédex entries, there is the actual ocean that inspired all of this. The real water, the place that is 70% of the planet's surface and still largely unmapped. The place where the things that have not yet been named are still swimming in the dark. Game Freak spent 30 years building a world full of those things, and the water type is where most of them live. Closing, the water type has been here from the beginning, and it will be here for however long the Pokémon franchise continues. It is the most common type. It is the type that carries you when you cannot carry yourself. It fills the space between places you need to go. It holds at its bottom the oldest and most powerful things in the world of Pokémon. Creatures that choose solitude not from weakness but from wisdom. Creatures that purify as they pass. Creatures that sing in the dark where no one is watching. It is the type that has given you your companion for every ocean crossing. The reliable surf user you kept on your team, not just for battles, but because without them the map ends at the shore. The type that made HMs worth the cost of a valuable move slot, because what Surf unlocked was worth any price. You came to the water's edge and your Pokémon waded in and the music changed, and the open water stretched out ahead of you, and there was nowhere you could not go. The real oceans on Earth cover more than 70% of the planet's surface, and the deepest parts of them are less explored than the surface of the moon. There are things down there that no one has seen. There are bioluminescent creatures drifting in complete darkness that have never encountered light in their lives. There are geological formations at the seafloor that have been building since before humans existed. The ocean is a different world, layered and vast and largely unknown, and every culture on Earth has built mythology around it because it demands that response. It is too large and too mysterious to be left without stories. The Pokémon franchise, in its water type, built a small and beautiful version of that mythology. From the humblest fish flopping helplessly on the surface to the guardian that sleeps at the bottom of oceanic trenches to avoid causing damage with the power it carries, the water type holds more of the world's strangeness and beauty and quiet sadness than any other type in the series. 30 years of games. 30 years of Pokédex entries written by people who cared enough to put real thought into 2 sentences about a fictional fish. 30 years of players sitting at the edge of water with a team they built themselves, and a companion they chose, pressing forward into the unknown routes and the deep currents, finding things no one told them were there. That is a long time to love something, and the water type has been worth every year of it. It has been a pleasure going into all of this with you tonight. I hope the information carried you somewhere restful. I hope the gentle weight of these stories, the myths and the biology and the design decisions, and the small moments of poetry buried in Pokedex entries, I hope all of that gave your mind something interesting to drift through as the night deepened. If you are still with me right now, thank you. Genuinely, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. If you found this useful or relaxing or worth your time, a like helps more than you might think. A subscription means you will know when the next one comes. And if there is a type, a Pokemon, a region, a piece of lore you want to go deep on, tell me in the comments. Tell me what you want to fall asleep to next time. I will be here. I will have done the research. Rest well.